The universe is old. Older than any mind, human or otherwise, can truly comprehend. It has watched stars ignite and collapse. It has seen galaxies spiral into themselves like dying flowers. It has witnessed civilizations rise from the mud of forgotten planets, reach toward the sky with trembling hands, and then vanish without so much as a whisper left behind in the dark. For 4 billion years, Earth was unremarkable. A blue dot. A water-soaked rock orbiting an average yellow star in an average spiral arm of an average galaxy. The kind of planet that most spacefaring civilizations catalogued, noted, and dismissed. Too much water. Too much oxygen. Too much biological chaos. The creatures that lived on it were loud, messy, violent, and, according to every galactic survey ever conducted, deeply, profoundly, almost comically unaware of the universe around them. The Vorkai Empire had passed Earth's solar system 17 times across the last 2,000 years. 17 times, their long-range scouts had scanned the third planet from that yellow star. 17 times, they had recorded the same data. Primitive electromagnetic signals, chemical pollution in the atmosphere, crude metal and fire spacecraft that barely scraped the edge of the planet's own gravity well, and a population of roughly 8 billion carbon-based bipedal creatures who spent most of their energy fighting each other. 17 times, the Vorkai had moved on. Earth was not worth conquering. It was not worth the fuel. But that was before. Before the Vorkai lost the Keth corridor. Before the Dominion of Shul pushed their borders back 300 light-years in a single generation. Before High Commander Vorkai Drex, the most decorated military mind in the Empire's 6,000-year history, looked at a star map and pointed one long, gray, six-fingered hand at the blue dot and said, "There. That is where we rebuild." The first human to detect them was not a soldier. She was a graduate student. Her name was Maya Chen, 26 years old, born in Portland, Oregon, currently surviving on instant noodles and black coffee in a cramped office at the Atacama Large Millimeter Array Facility in northern Chile. She had been assigned to cross-check data from the array's deep space monitoring program as part of her doctoral thesis on anomalous radio wave patterns in the outer solar system. It was 3:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in October when Maya pushed her glasses up her nose, squinted at her monitor, and said very quietly to absolutely no one, "That's not right." The signal was coming from beyond the heliopause, the very edge of where the sun's influence ended and true interstellar space began. It was tight, focused, layered in a way that no natural phenomenon could produce. It had structure. It had repetition. It had the unmistakable signature of something that had been designed. Maya stared at it for 45 minutes. She checked the equipment 3 times. She ran the data through 2 different analysis programs. Then she picked up her phone and called her thesis advisor, Dr. James Whitfield, 61 years old, retired Air Force Signals Intelligence Officer turned astrophysicist. A man who had spent 30 years waiting for exactly this kind of phone call and had quietly, privately, begun to believe it would never come. He answered on the second ring. "Dr. Whitfield," Maya said, her voice very careful and very controlled. "I think you need to come in." "Maya, it's 3 in the morning." "I know." Pause. "Sir, I think you really need to come in." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then James Whitfield said, "Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 14. He stood behind Maya's chair for a long time, looking at her screen, his hands folded behind his back, his face doing something complicated that Maya had never seen on it before. James Whitfield was not a man who showed emotion easily. In 30 years of intelligence work and 20 years of academia, he had cultivated an expression of permanent, mild, slightly amused detachment that his students called the Whitfield Wall. The wall was cracking. "How long has this been transmitting?" he asked. "Based on what I can pull from the archive data, at least 72 hours, Maya said. "But Dr. Whitfield, look at the source coordinates." She pulled up a second window. "It's not stationary. It's moving. And it's moving toward us." Whitfield leaned closer to the screen. "How fast?" he asked. Maya had run the calculation 4 times because she didn't believe the answer. 0.27 light speed, she said. "And accelerating." Another long silence. "How many sources?" Whitfield asked. Maya had been dreading this question. "As of 30 minutes ago?" She pulled up the full spectral map. 412 distinct signal points. All moving in coordinated formation. All accelerating on the same vector. The room was very quiet. Outside, the Atacama Desert stretched away in every direction under a sky so clear and so full of stars that it looked almost artificial, like a painting someone had made of what a sky should look like. The Milky Way was a river of cold fire from horizon to horizon. James Whitfield straightened up slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He scrolled to a number that had no name attached to it. Just a string of digits that he had memorized 23 years ago and never used and never expected to use, and had nonetheless renewed every year when the secure line it connected to was updated, because James Whitfield was the kind of man who believed in being ready. "Dr. Whitfield," Maya said quietly. "Who are you calling?" "The right people," he said and pressed dial. The right people turned out to be a chain reaction. Whitfield called a number. That number connected to a secure relay station in Colorado Springs, which forwarded the call to a duty officer at NORAD, who patched it through to the Pentagon Space Operations Command, which woke up a 3-star general named Raymond Cole, who listened to 40 seconds of summary and then said, with the measured calm of a man who had trained his entire life for emergencies, "Hold the line," and then immediately called the White House Situation Room. The Situation Room called the Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff called the President. At 4:47 a.m. Eastern Time, President Sarah Alden, 54 years old, former senator from Ohio, first woman to command the United States Space Force before entering politics, sat in the Situation Room in a bathrobe with a cup of coffee and listened to General Raymond Cole explain what Maya Chen had found in the Chilean desert. Sarah Alden did not panic. She had a reputation for not panicking that her staff both admired and privately found slightly unnerving. She had once calmly finished a press conference while being told in her earpiece that a hostile nation had just launched a satellite strike against a U.S. military installation. She had negotiated 3 international crises without raising her voice once. Her campaign slogan had been "Steady Hands," and the people who knew her best said it was the most accurate political slogan they had ever seen. She listened to Cole's full briefing without interrupting. Then she asked 4 questions. How long until they reach the outer planets? At current acceleration, roughly 16 days, Madam President. How long until they reach Earth orbit? 22 days. Possibly 20 if they increase speed. Do we know if they've detected us yet? Unknown, ma'am. But given the signal patterns Dr. Chen identified, it's possible they've been observing us for much longer than 72 hours. And our response capability? General Cole had been in the military for 38 years. He had fought in 2 wars, commanded 3 theater operations and briefed 5 presidents. He was not a man who was easily made uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable now. "Madam President," he said carefully, "our current space-based defense capabilities were designed for near-Earth threats. Satellites, missiles, rogue spacecraft. Nothing in our arsenal was designed to engage this." Sarah Alden was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Get me Director Hansen at Space Force Command, Admiral Torres from Pacific Fleet, and whoever our best minds are at DARPA and JPL. I want them all in this room in 4 hours." She paused. "And get me a real cup of coffee. This one's cold." The meeting that happened 4 hours later in the White House Situation Room would be described, by the 7 people who were present and the 3 who were patched in remotely, as the strangest and most consequential meeting in human history. It lasted 11 hours. It began with a presentation of the data. Maya Chen had been flown to Washington on a military jet, still wearing the flannel shirt and jeans she'd had on when she found the signal, her laptop clutched to her chest like a shield. She stood at the head of a table surrounded by generals and admirals and scientists and intelligence directors, pushed her glasses up her nose, and walked them through her findings with the same quiet precision she used when presenting to her thesis committee. Nobody interrupted her. When she finished, the room was silent for almost a full minute. Then Director Lisa Hansen of Space Force Command, a compact, silver-haired woman with the eyes of someone who had spent 40 years looking at things most people never got to see, said, "How confident are you in the formation data?" 412 objects. That's a precise number. 412 confirmed, Maya said. The actual number could be higher. Some signatures may be masked by the leading elements. The formation is, she paused, searching for the right word, disciplined. Whoever they are, they know how to move through space. Are they armed? Someone asked. I don't have data on that, Maya said honestly. But they're not hiding. They're broadcasting. And a civilization that can travel at 0.27 light speed and sends 400 ships. She stopped again. They're not coming to say hello. Admiral Marco Torres, Pacific Fleet Commander, a man built like a ship himself, broad and solid and seemingly immovable, leaned forward in his chair. What's our first line of defense? And that was when the real conversation began. What followed was not the orderly, decisive military planning session that movies always depicted. It was messy and fractious and terrifying and brilliant by turns. Arguments broke out. Voices were raised. One of the DARPA scientists, a young man named Derek Park, actually stood up at one point and said, "No, no, no, that's completely wrong," to a 3-star general, and the general, to his credit, listened. By the time the sun went down on Washington, D.C., they had the outlines of something that was either the most audacious military strategy in human history, or the last desperate gamble of a species that hadn't even known it was in danger 3 days ago. General Cole called it Operation Caro. Because, he said, looking around the table at the exhausted, frightened, determined faces of the people who would have to carry it out, when they get here, they're going to learn what that word means. Nobody slept that night. In Chile, Maya Chin sat on the roof of the Atacama facility and looked up at the stars and thought about her mother, who was in Portland, Oregon, who thought her daughter was doing data analysis for her dissertation and had no idea that the world was about to change forever. In Washington, President Sarah Alden stood at the window of the Oval Office and watched the sun rise over the Rose Garden and thought about the 7 billion people who were going about their lives right now, drinking coffee, driving to work, arguing with their kids about homework, falling in love, falling out of love, being born and dying and everything in between, all completely unaware. In a converted warehouse in Pasadena, California, a team of 37 scientists and engineers at JPL who had just been read into the most classified project in history were already tearing apart existing satellite and weapons designs and asking themselves the only question that mattered now. What can we build in 20 days that can stop 400 alien warships? And in the vast, cold dark between the stars, moving at a speed that compressed the distance between them and the blue dot with every passing second, 412 ships of the Vorkai Empire moved in perfect formation, their sensors scanning ahead, their weapons charged, their crews certain of victory. They had conquered 11 worlds. They had never lost a campaign. They had no reason to believe this would be different. They had not yet learned the most important thing about the creatures on the blue dot. They had not yet learned what humans do when they're cornered. The man they needed was not easy to find. Not because he was hiding, exactly, but because Colonel Daniel Dan Reeves, 43 years old, formerly of the United States Space Force's classified 9th Combat Operations Wing, currently residing in a rented house in Bozeman, Montana with 2 dogs, a broken-down truck, and a standing Tuesday night poker game with his neighbors, had made it very clear when he resigned his commission 18 months ago that he did not want to be found. The resignation had not been quiet. There had been hearings. There had been a formal reprimand. There had been a classified incident report 3 inches thick that nobody below a certain clearance level was allowed to read, and above that clearance level, most people preferred not to. The short version, the version that circulated in the corridors of Peterson Space Force Base and the Pentagon's E-Ring, was that Colonel Dan Reeves had been the commanding officer of the Orbital Defense Rapid Response Group, the ODRRG, the most advanced space-based weapons program the United States had ever built and never publicly acknowledged. And he had, 18 months ago, in the middle of an exercise designed to simulate a coordinated attack on Earth's orbital infrastructure, looked at the results of that exercise and written a report so scathing, so detailed, and so brutally honest about the actual state of humanity's ability to defend itself from a serious space-based threat that his superiors had buried the report, stripped him of his command, and suggested, strongly, that he might be happier pursuing other opportunities. He had been furious. He had been right. The woman they sent to find him was Captain Zoe Vasquez, 31 years old, Space Force Intelligence, who had been awake for 36 hours when she landed at Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday and drove a rental car to the address she'd been given. The house was small and needed painting. There was a rusted basketball hoop in the driveway. 2 large dogs, a German Shepherd and what appeared to be a Lab Husky mix, rushed the fence when she pulled in and barked with enormous enthusiasm. The man who came to the door was tall, lean, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that had been lived in hard. He was wearing a flannel shirt and holding a mug of coffee, and he looked at Zoe Vasquez with eyes that were already, before she'd said a single word, deeply, profoundly tired of whatever she was about to say. "Colonel Reeves," she said. "I'm not a colonel anymore," he said. "Sir." "I'm also not a sir." Zoe took a breath. "Mr. Reeves. I'm Captain Vasquez, Space Force Intelligence. I've been sent by General Cole and President Alden. I don't care. Because we have a situation that—" "I said I don't care, Captain." His voice was flat. Not angry. Just closed. "Whatever it is, the answer is no. I wrote a report that told them everything they needed to know about our preparedness, and they buried it. I don't work for people who bury the truth. Mr. Reeves." Zoe reached into her bag and took out a tablet. She had been authorized to show him one piece of information and one piece only, the minimum necessary to get him into a car. She pulled up the signal data. The formation data. The closing speed. She held it out to him. He looked at it for a long moment. The dogs had stopped barking. One of them, the German Shepherd, sat down next to Reeves's leg and leaned against him as if sensing something. How long? Reeves asked. His voice had changed. 22 days to Earth orbit. Possibly 20. A long silence. Reeves looked down at his dogs. Then up at the sky, the clear Montana sky, still faintly pink with the last of the sunrise. How many ships? He asked. 412 confirmed. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, let me get my jacket. They flew him to Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado on a military transport. From there he was on a supersonic jet to Washington within the hour. He used the flight time to read everything, every piece of data, every analysis, every proposed response plan that had been generated in the 48 hours since Maya Chen's discovery. By the time they landed, he had made 40 pages of handwritten notes and was already, Zoe Vasquez noticed, looking less like a retired man in a flannel shirt and more like the person his file said he was. He walked into the White House Situation Room at 2 p.m. and stopped when he saw who was at the table. General Cole, Admiral Torres, Director Hansen, 5 other people he recognized, and President Alden, who looked up from the briefing she was reading and said, Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming. With respect, Madam President, Dan Reeves said, pulling out a chair and sitting down, you should have listened to my report 18 months ago. The room went very still. Sarah Alden looked at him for a moment. Then, to the surprise of everyone present, she said, you're right. And I'm sorry we didn't. But we're here now and I need your best thinking, not your grievances. Can you do that? Dan Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. Good. She slid a folder across the table. Then tell me why every plan we've developed so far is wrong. He spent 3 hours going through their plans. He was not gentle about it. This doesn't work, he said, pointing to the first proposal, a mass launch of existing missile defense satellites into intercept positions. We have 87 functional platforms capable of offensive action in orbit. They have 412 ships moving at 0.27 light. By the time our platforms get into position, the enemy formation will have already changed its approach vector twice. We'd be shooting at where they were, not where they are. He moved to the second proposal, kinetic impactors launched from the lunar surface. This is closer to right, he said, but our lunar installations aren't configured for offensive action. Reconfiguring them would take 60 days minimum. We have 20. He moved to the third proposal. Who wrote this? He asked. Silence. This is, he paused, choosing his words. This is creative. I'll give them that. But it assumes they'll slow down on final approach and engage us in a conventional battle. What if they don't? What if they just, he made a gesture with his hand, accelerate through our orbital defenses and hit the surface directly? At 0.1 light speed, even a ship the size of a school bus would. We know, General Cole said quietly. Then why does no one in any of these plans address it? Another silence. Because, Dan Reeves understood without anyone saying it, the people who had written these plans were trying not to think about that scenario. Because thinking about that scenario meant accepting something that none of them were ready to accept. That they might not be able to stop them. That the best they could do was hurt them. That the best case scenario was not victory but cost. Making the price of taking Earth so high that the Vorkai Empire decided the blue dot wasn't worth it after all. Dan Reeves had thought about this his entire career. He opened his folder. Here's what I think we should do, he said. What he proposed was not elegant. It was not the kind of clean, decisive, cinematic military strategy that made for good briefing slides. It was layered and ugly and required doing 17 things simultaneously that had never been attempted before, and it depended heavily on the enemy behaving in ways that Dan Reeves was not 100% certain they would behave. But it was, everyone in the room recognized immediately, the most coherent plan they had heard. 3 layers, Reeves said, drawing on the digital whiteboard with a focus that made him look entirely different from the man who had answered his door in Montana that morning. The first layer is detection and disruption. We don't wait for them to reach Jupiter. We send everything we have that can operate at interplanetary range, probes, relay satellites, anything with a working transmitter, out to the asteroid belt and beyond. We flood the space ahead of them with signals. Jam their communications if we can. Force them to go electromagnetic dark, which means they lose coordination, which means their formation degrades. You think that'll work? Admiral Torres asked. I think it'll annoy them, Reeves said. And an annoyed enemy is a distracted enemy. He moved to the second layer. Layer 2 is the trap. Our problem is numbers and firepower. They almost certainly have both over us. But they have one weakness. He tapped the formation diagram. Look at this. 412 ships, all on the same vector, all accelerating at the same rate. That's not an exploratory fleet. That's an invasion force. And invasion forces, historically, move in ways that are predictable because the goal is to arrive with your force intact. They won't scatter. They'll stay together. So we use that against them, General Cole said slowly. We use that against them, Reeves agreed. If we can create a choke point, a zone where we have concentrated defenses and they have to pass through in a relatively tight formation. Between Mars and the asteroid belt, Director Hansen said immediately. Reeves pointed at her. Exactly. The Reeves line, someone murmured. Don't call it that, Reeves said, but something flickered across his face. Layer 3 is what I call a HFY, the last stand. Everything we have in reserve held back from layers 1 and 2, positioned in high Earth orbit. If something gets through layers 1 and 2, and something will because we are not going to destroy a 400-ship fleet with what we have, it meets everything we've got left and we make it as expensive as possible. Silence. This is a fighting retreat, Admiral Torres said. This is a controlled engagement designed to maximize attrition of enemy forces before they reach Earth, Reeves said carefully. That's the same thing. Yes, Reeves said. It is. President Alden had been listening without speaking. Now she said, what's our realistic assessment? If we do all of this, all 3 layers, what are the odds? Dan Reeves was quiet for a moment. I'll tell you what the odds aren't, he said finally. They're not 0. And 22 days ago, before Captain Vasquez showed up at my door, if you'd asked me what the odds were of humanity having any chance at all against a 400-ship alien invasion fleet, I would have said 0. He looked around the table. So that's something. That's not very reassuring, someone said. No, Reeves agreed. It's not. He paused. But here's what I know about humans that I don't know about the Vorkai. He used the name without even noticing the small shift in atmosphere that went around the room when he used it. The name that the intelligence people had extracted from analysis of the signal patterns, the best approximation of what the approaching fleet called itself. I know what humans do when they're backed into a corner. I know what humans do when the thing they love is threatened. His voice was quiet and very steady. I've seen it. And it is the most dangerous thing in the universe. The room was very quiet. Sarah Alden looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. Let's build your trap. The next 12 days were unlike anything in the history of human civilization. The decision was made, after considerable, painful debate, to keep the situation classified at the highest level for the first 72 hours. Not to hide it from the world, but to avoid the collapse of global stability before any defense could be organized. Panic, Director Hansen argued with the cold precision of someone who had modeled it, would kill more people in the first 24 hours than the Vorkai might kill if they arrived tomorrow. But the secret could not be kept for long. It broke on day 3. Not through any leak, though there were people in every government on Earth who would spend years afterward arguing about how it happened. It broke because a 14-year-old amateur astronomer in New Zealand named Tommy Walsh pointed his homemade telescope at the right patch of sky at the right time and photographed something that his software flagged as anomalous, and Tommy Walsh, because he was 14 and excited and had 800,000 followers on his astronomy blog, posted the image online within 20 minutes of taking it. By the time government communications teams in 6 countries scrambled to respond, the image had been seen by 40 million people. By the time President Alden went on live television 11 hours later to address the world, it had been seen by 4 billion. She spoke for 32 minutes. She was honest. She was calm. She was, by every measure anyone could apply, exactly what the moment needed. She said, "We are not alone in the universe. We have always suspected this. Today we know it. And what we know, what our best scientists and military minds confirm, is that a fleet of spacecraft from beyond our solar system is approaching Earth. Their intentions are not peaceful." She paused. "I will not pretend to you that this is not dangerous. I will not pretend to you that we are not afraid. But I will tell you this, we are not helpless. We are not unprepared. And we are not alone, because every nation on this planet has, in the last 72 hours, joined together in a way I did not dare hope for but never stopped believing was possible." That was the other thing that had happened in those 72 hours. Because while Dan Reeves was building his strategy in the Situation Room, Sarah Alden had been making phone calls. To Moscow. To Beijing. To Brussels and New Delhi and Tokyo and Canberra and Pretoria and every capital on Earth. She had spoken to 43 heads of state in 3 days. Some conversations were easy. Some were not. Some required the kind of diplomatic courage that made her staff wince. But by the time she went on television, every major space-capable nation on Earth had pledged its resources, its technology, and its personnel to the unified defense. Humanity, for the first time in its violent and fractious history, was going to fight as one. The place they chose for the Central Command was not in Washington or Moscow or Beijing. It was in a converted hangar at Johnston Atoll, a remote military installation in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, chosen because it was geographically equidistant from most major power centers, because it had existing secure communications infrastructure, and because, practically speaking, it was hard to approach without being noticed. They called it the Forge. Within 72 hours of President Alden's broadcast, the Forge contained the most extraordinary collection of human talent ever assembled in one place. Dan Reeves was there, running military strategy with a team of 18 commanders drawn from the US, Russia, China, the EU, India, Japan, Australia, and Brazil. Maya Chen was there, leading the Scientific Monitoring Division with a team of 40 astronomers and physicists who were tracking the approaching fleet in real time, updating the trajectory models every 6 hours. Dr. James Whitfield was there, heading signals intelligence, the effort to understand and, if possible, communicate with or disrupt the Vorkai's communication systems. Director Lisa Hansen was there as the overall coordinator, the person who kept all the pieces moving in the same direction. And there were hundreds of others. Engineers, programmers, weapons designers, propulsion experts, medical officers, psychologists, because someone had thought far enough ahead to realize that the people in this room were going to need psychological support if they were going to keep functioning. The mood at the Forge was the strangest atmosphere anyone there had ever experienced. It was focused and terrified and electric and exhausted all at once. People who had been professional rivals or diplomatic adversaries for decades worked side by side without incident because they had all looked at the same data and understood the same thing. None of the old arguments mattered anymore. One Russian aerospace engineer, Dmitry Volkov, a man who had spent 20 years designing weapons systems specifically intended to counter American space capabilities, found himself at 2 a.m. one morning working with Captain Sarah Kim of the U.S. Space Force on a targeting algorithm. They were arguing fiercely about the optimal approach vector. Not in a hostile way but in the way of two very smart people who disagreed and both knew that getting it right might save the world. Your model assumes constant acceleration, Volkov said, gesturing at the screen. Their acceleration has been constant for the last 9 days, Kim said. Their acceleration has been constant for the last 9 days that we know about, Volkov corrected. The moment they detect our defensive preparations, and they are not stupid, they will adjust. Your model needs to be dynamic. Kim looked at him for a moment. Then, you're right. Volkov blinked. He had not expected that. Run your model, Kim said. I'll run mine. We cross-reference them and build a hybrid. They worked until sunrise. The algorithm they produced together was better than either of them could have built alone. It would later be incorporated into the targeting systems of every orbital platform in Earth's defense grid. This was, in miniature, what was happening everywhere at the Forge. The sum of human knowledge being poured into a single desperate effort, amplified by the fact that the people doing it were working not for their country or their career or their institution, but for something larger and older and more fundamental. They were working for everyone they had ever loved. What they built in those 20 days was, by any objective standard, remarkable. Not because it was sufficient. No honest assessment suggested that what humanity could assemble in 3 weeks was sufficient to destroy a 400-ship fleet from a civilization thousands of years more advanced. But it was remarkable because of what it was, a demonstration of what humans could do when they decided, collectively and without reservation, that something needed doing. The asteroid belt reconfiguration, code-named Ironwall, involved redirecting 47 existing deep space probes and relay satellites into new positions, creating a detection and jamming network that stretched across the inner solar system. This was done by teams of engineers in 6 countries working in rotating shifts, reprogramming systems that had never been designed for this purpose, solving problems in real time that would normally have taken years of testing and refinement. The lunar installations, there were 3 of them, research stations operated by the United States, China, and a joint European consortium, were partially converted to offensive capability. They couldn't be fully weaponized in 20 days, but they could be equipped with high-powered laser systems and the new generation of kinetic impactors that DARPA had been quietly developing for the last 5 years. The crews of those stations, 19 people total, were given the choice to leave or stay. All 19 chose to stay. The orbital grid, What Reeves called the first real space navy in human history, was assembled from existing assets and emergency launches. 14 nations contributed spacecraft of various types. Most of them were converted research or communications platforms hastily fitted with weapons packages. None of them were warships in the traditional sense. All of them were crewed by volunteers. Dan Reeves looked at the assembled fleet on a holographic display 7 days before the Vorkai were expected to reach the asteroid belt and felt something he didn't quite have a word for. It was not pride. It was bigger than pride. It was something closer to awe. Is it enough? General Cole asked him. I don't know, Reeves said honestly. But it's everything we've got. Maya Chin found him on the roof of the Johnston Atoll Command Center at midnight on day 13. She had tracked him there because she needed to talk to someone and everyone else in her division was either asleep or, she suspected, about to break down, and she had looked at Daniel Reeves in meeting after meeting and recognized in him something she recognized in herself. The particular steadiness of someone who has accepted the worst-case scenario and is functioning anyway. Can I sit here? She asked. He gestured at the space beside him on the concrete parapet. She sat. The Pacific Ocean spread out in every direction under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. She had her laptop, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking up. You can't see them yet, she said. They're still past Jupiter. But, she paused. I know they're there. I feel like I should be able to see them. What do you see when you look at that? Reeves asked, nodding at the sky. Maya thought about it. My thesis, she said, and then unexpectedly she laughed, a short, tired, genuine laugh. I was going to write my thesis about anomalous radio wave patterns in the outer solar system. My advisor always said I should pick a more practical topic. She paused. I think this is practical enough. Reeves almost smiled. You're 26, he said. Yes. You found them. My equipment found them. I just happened to be the one looking at the screen. No, Reeves said. You happened to be the one looking at the screen who understood what she was seeing. Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment. If you'd been anyone else, if you'd dismissed it as instrument error or saved it for morning, we'd have 10 days less to prepare. Maya was quiet. 10 days matters, Reeves said. 10 days might be the difference. Does it feel like enough? She asked. What we've built. He was quiet for a long time. I've spent my whole career thinking about this question, he said finally. Not aliens specifically, I thought about it, but in the abstract. I thought about it in terms of any advanced enough adversary. What does it take to stop something that's more powerful than you? And I kept coming back to the same answer. He paused. It's not firepower. It's not technology. It's the willingness to pay the price, whatever the price is. To keep going after the first hit. The second hit. To look at something that's bigger and stronger and faster than you and refuse to accept that the outcome is already determined. Caro, Maya said softly. He looked at her. Someone told me that word, she said. One of the Korean engineers on Dr. Volkov's team. He said it means something like, then, and then what? The determination to always ask, and then what? No matter what happens. Caro, Reeves repeated. And then what? And then what? Maya agreed. They sat in silence for a while, looking up at a sky full of stars that had just, in the span of 2 weeks, become a great deal more complicated. On day 15, Dr. James Whitfield came to Dan Reeves with something extraordinary. I think we can talk to them, Whitfield said. Reeves looked up from the targeting models he'd been working on. What? The signal analysis. Whitfield spread printouts across the table. We've been treating their communications as something to disrupt or intercept. But look at the underlying structure. The encoding it's different from anything in the mathematical communication protocols we've theorized for SETI, but it's not completely unlike them. He pointed to a series of waveforms. There are mathematical constants in here. What? The Fibonacci sequence. Prime numbers. These are not random, they're deliberate. And the pattern repeats on a cycle that suggests it's broadcast, not tactical communication. They're announcing themselves, Reeves said slowly. They're announcing themselves, Whitfield confirmed. And I'm not certain, but I think, embedded in the announcement is a demand structure. Like the beginning of a formal ultimatum. They're telling us to surrender. I think they're telling us to acknowledge them. The surrender part may come after. Whitfield paused. The question is, do we respond? Reeves thought about it. If we respond, we confirm that we've detected them. They may already know we have, but we confirm it. Yes. If we respond, they know we have communication capability, which tells them something about our technological level. Yes. And if we respond incorrectly, Reeves paused. If we say something that reads as defiant, they might accelerate. Throw out our timeline calculations. All of that is true, Whitfield said. What does your gut tell you, James? Whitfield was quiet for a moment. I've spent my whole career trying to imagine what first contact would look like, he said. I spent 30 years in signals intelligence and 20 years in astrophysics, and the thing I always believed, the thing I still believe, is that communication is never the wrong choice. Even with an enemy. Especially with an enemy. He paused. If we can make them hesitate, even for 6 hours, even for 3. We might need that time. We might need that time. Reeves stood up. I'll take it to the president. The president's response was characteristic. She listened to the full briefing in 12 minutes. She asked 4 clarifying questions. Then she said, draft a response. Something that says we hear them. That we're here. That we're not afraid. She paused. And make it true, James. I want it to be true when we send it. Whitfield spent 6 hours on the response. He consulted with mathematicians and linguists and the signals team and, unexpectedly, with Maya Chin, who turned out to have a rare gift for pattern logic and contributed 3 key structural elements to the final message. When it was done, they transmitted it on the same frequency and in the same encoding structure as the Vorkai signal. It said, in the closest mathematical approximation to human language they could construct. We are here. We are aware. We are ready. 3 words. 3 true words. The response from the Vorkai fleet came 41 minutes later. Whitfield and his team worked on it for 4 hours. What they eventually translated, with significant uncertainty about specific nuances, but confidence about the overall meaning, was something like, you are small. You are brief. You are finished. Dan Reeves, when he heard the translation, said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at the table of commanders around him and said very quietly, good. Let them think that. Day 17. The Vorkai fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter. Maya's monitoring team tracked them in real time on the massive holographic display at the center of the Forge's command floor. 412 glowing points of light moving in their disciplined formation, their speed still increasing, their trajectory unchanged. They're not stopping at Jupiter, Dr. Park said almost to himself. He was one of the DARPA scientists, the young one who had told the general he was wrong, and he had turned out to be brilliant in ways that kept surprising everyone around him. I thought they might establish a staging area. Resupply. Assess our defenses. They've already assessed our defenses, Maya said. They've been watching us for at least 3 weeks. Possibly much longer. Then they know what we've built. Yes. Derek Park was quiet for a moment. And they're not stopping. No, Maya said. They're not stopping. She looked at the display. 412 lights, moving in perfect formation, unhurried, inevitable. She thought about what it must look like from inside one of those ships. The solar system spreading out ahead of them, this familiar star system that humans had looked at from the other direction for their entire history, and somewhere in it, a blue dot that they had decided to take. She thought, they don't know what they're walking into. And then she thought, we don't either. And then she thought, Carol. And then what? And she went back to work. The first engagement happened not at the asteroid belt, where Reeves's trap was set, but further out, at a point approximately 200 million kilometers from the Sun, where the outermost element of the iron wall detection network intersected with the Vorkai fleet's approach vector. It was not planned. One of the iron wall probes, a repurposed deep space relay satellite originally owned by the European Space Agency, redesignated UDF-7 for the defense network, had been broadcasting its jamming signal for 11 days when the leading edge of the Vorkai formation came within range. The probe's automated systems registered the proximity of multiple large objects moving at high speed and, following its programming, increased its jamming output. The Vorkai ship at the head of the formation, later analysis suggested it was a scout vessel, smaller than the main fleet elements, responded to the jamming signal by firing. The probe was vaporized in approximately 0.3 seconds. But in those 0.3 seconds, UDF-7 sensors had transmitted a full sensor package back to the Forge, including the first close-range data on the energy signature of a Vorkai weapon. At the Forge, the weapon data went directly to a team of 4 physicists who had been waiting for exactly this information. Plasma-based, said Dr. Keiko Tanaka, the team lead, a Japanese physicist who had worked on fusion reactor design for 15 years before being recruited for this project. High temperature, magnetically confined. She pulled up her models. The good news is that magnetically confined plasma is susceptible to interference. The bad news is, She ran the numbers. The discharge energy is approximately 40 times what our best point defense systems are designed to handle. 40 times. Dan Reeves, standing behind her, processed that number. So a direct hit on any of our platforms, he said, would be catastrophic, Keiko said simply. Yes. What about indirect? Proximity burst, not direct impact. She ran more calculations. Possible degradation, possible system damage, but not necessarily catastrophic. So we need to not get hit. That would be advisable. Can we interfere with the magnetic confinement? Destabilize the shot before it fires? Keiko looked at him. Then at her models. Then back at him. Give me 4 hours, she said. You have 3, he said. She had it in 2. The countermeasure she designed, a precisely tuned electromagnetic pulse that could, in theory, disrupt the magnetic confinement of the Vorkai weapon system in the fraction of a second before discharge, causing the plasma to disperse rather than fire, was immediately transmitted to every human platform in the defense grid. It had never been tested. It was built entirely on models derived from 43 seconds of data from a probe that no longer existed. Will it work? General Cole asked. Probably, Keiko said. Probably? The confidence interval is 67%, she said, which was the precise and scientific way of saying that she had no idea. 67%, Cole repeated. When this is over, Keiko said quietly, I would very much like to run a proper test. The Vorkai fleet entered the asteroid belt on day 19. They did so with the supreme confidence of a force that had done this 11 times before on 11 different worlds, and every time the world's defenders had either fled, surrendered, or been destroyed. The Vorkai had a word for civilizations at humanity's approximate level of development. It translated, roughly, to pre-conclusion, meaning a civilization whose end, upon contact with the Empire, was already determined. Already concluded before it even began. High Commander Vorkai Drex, in his command chamber aboard the flagship Eternal Resolve, watched the asteroid belt resolve on his displays and felt a familiar, almost comfortable certainty. This was the part he found slightly tedious, honestly. The pre-conclusion worlds always did the same thing. They scrambled. They gathered their primitive forces. They sent signals that were pathetic in their defiance. And then, when the fleet arrived and the weapons spoke, it was over quickly. The variables were engagement time and resource expenditure. How fast could you pacify the population? How much did you need to destroy before the survivors understood cooperation was the only option? The signal they had received was interesting, he had to admit. We are here. We are aware. We are ready. Mathematical precision in the encoding, which was unusual for a pre-conclusion world at this stage. But the sentiment itself, defiant, yes, but the defiance of a creature that does not know its own smallness. He was about to call for the standard formation approach through the asteroid belt, accelerate, maintain cohesion, ignore the debris field, when his tactical officer said something that made him pause. Commander. The asteroid field ahead. I'm reading unusual energy signatures from several of the larger bodies. Natural variations, Drex said. No, Commander. The tactical officer's voice was uncertain, and uncertainty was not common in Vorkai tactical officers. These signatures are manufactured. There are devices on these asteroids. Drex straightened in his command chair. How many devices? I'm still counting. At minimum, several hundred distributed across a zone approximately, the officer paused, approximately 40 million kilometers wide. Drex was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the pre-conclusion world did this. It appears so, Commander. Drex thought about this. Several hundred devices distributed across a 40 million kilometer zone, in the path of his fleet's approach vector. In his 6,000-year empire's history of conducting planetary conquest operations, this was new. Pre-conclusion worlds occasionally managed a few orbital defense platforms, sometimes a missile battery or two. They had never managed anything at this scale. Pull up everything we have on this species, he said. The data came up. Small. Primitive. Violent. The usual profile. But the devices in the asteroid belt were not the work of a primitive species. Maintain formation, Drex said. Weapons to full readiness. Scout elements forward. He paused. Let us see what they've built. What they had built, as the Vorkai scouts were about to discover, was the largest coordinated weapons deployment in human history. Across the asteroid belt, on and around and between 67 asteroids carefully selected for size, position and trajectory, the combined engineering teams of 14 nations had placed 112 kinetic impactor platforms, essentially very large, very fast-moving metal projectiles on autonomous guidance systems, designed to intercept and strike Vorkai vessels in the high-velocity chaos of a close engagement. 89 electromagnetic pulse emitters, Keiko Tanaka's countermeasure system, scaled up and modified for area effect, positioned to disrupt the magnetic confinement of Vorkai weapon systems across a wide zone. 44 high-powered laser platforms, converted from the lunar installation systems, extended range variants capable of sustained fire at ranges out to approximately 3 million kilometers. And distributed throughout the field in a pattern designed by Dmitry Volkov's team specifically to be difficult to detect and almost impossible to avoid. 207 autonomous drone units. The drones were Dan Reeves's idea. They were small, roughly the size of a compact car. They had no crew. They were not particularly advanced by the standards of what the defense teams had been building. Their guidance systems were good but not exceptional. Their weapons, a single kinetic impactor and a cluster of the EMP emitters, were limited. But they were small, and there were 207 of them, and they were already in position, cold and dark and waiting, when the Vorkai scouts entered the asteroid belt. The first exchange lasted 14 minutes. It began when a Vorkai scout vessel, moving at high speed through the outer edge of the asteroid belt, passed within close range of one of the drone units and the drone's automated proximity sensor activated. The drone fired its kinetic impactor. The Vorkai scout ship took a direct hit on its port side. The impact, a dense metal rod moving at 16 kilometers per second, did not destroy it. The Vorkai's hull armor was significantly better than anything in the drone's penetrating capability. But it did damage the scout's maneuvering systems, and the scout, suddenly unable to correct its trajectory, plowed into a 700-meter asteroid at 0.02 light speed. The explosion was visible from Earth with a naked eye, if you knew where to look. At the forge, the command floor erupted. Not in cheering. The situation was too tense for pure celebration. But there was something electric in the room, something that shifted as people realized. It works. We can hurt them. First contact, Maya said quietly, watching the sensor data. One vessel disabled, presumed destroyed. Vorkai fleet is reacting, formation is tightening. They're pulling their scouts back, said Captain Kim. They're reassessing, said Reeves. He was watching the display with intense concentration. They weren't expecting that. Good. He turned to the tactical team. Activate Iron Wall Layer 2. Full jamming sequence. Let's make their communications as messy as possible. The jamming went up across the entire asteroid belt zone. And the Vorkai fleet, for the first time in the history of the Vorkai Empire's 11 conquest operations, slowed down. What happened next was 14 minutes of controlled chaos that the analysts at the Forge would spend months afterwards untangling and trying to understand. The Vorkai response to the drone strike and the jamming was immediate and overwhelming. They fired into the asteroid field with their plasma weapons on wide dispersal, sweeping the zone ahead of the fleet with enormous energy expenditure, clearly attempting to clear the field of anything lurking in it. The plasma weapons on wide dispersal were significantly less effective than in direct fire mode. Many of the drones, built small specifically for survivability, absorbed glancing hits and kept functioning. The EMP emitters did their job, not on every shot, but with enough frequency that some of the Vorkai plasma bursts destabilized prematurely, their fire dissolving into dispersed plasma clouds rather than coherent bolts. 67% accuracy more or less. 33% of the shots that should have missed didn't miss. 9 drones were destroyed in the first sweep. But the kinetic impactor platforms, positioned behind the asteroid mass and protected by the rock itself, hadn't fired yet. And the laser platforms at extreme range had begun targeting the larger Vorkai vessels with sustained fire. Laser fire at multi-million kilometer range against a moving target was not enormously destructive. But it was constant, and constant fire against hull plating, sustained over minutes, began to create thermal stress that the Vorkai had not been expecting. 2 of the larger vessels altered their positions, breaking formation slightly to move out of the laser beam paths. When they did, they crossed into zones where Dmitry Volkov and Sarah Kim's targeting algorithm had predicted with some confidence that they might go. The kinetic impactor platforms fired. 6 simultaneous impacts on 2 Vorkai vessels. One of the vessels, they would later determine it was something analogous to a heavy cruiser, one of the largest ships in the fleet, took 3 direct hits. The first 2 hit its hull. The third hit something internal because the ship's drive system went dark. The vessel was not destroyed, but it was no longer under power. The second vessel took the other 3 impacts across its forward section. It continued under power, but its speed dropped significantly. 2 more vessels damaged. The Vorkai fleet stopped advancing. At the forge, Dan Reeves watched the display. The Vorkai fleet had halted its advance approximately 300 million kilometers from Earth. Their formation was tightening, reorganizing, which his instincts told him meant they were preparing a new approach. The pause would not last long. A force like that did not stop, it regrouped and accelerated, but it was a pause, and a pause was information. They didn't expect this, he said. No, General Cole agreed. They fought 11 pre-conclusion worlds. None of them did anything like this. Reeves pointed to the display. They're recalculating. Adjusting their model of what we are. He paused. That's what we need. We need them to be uncertain. We lost 11 drones. 2 of the kinetic impactor platforms were destroyed. 1 laser platform is offline, Captain Kim reported. We damaged or disabled 3 of their vessels. 409 versus the entirety of humanity's combined defense network. Still overwhelming odds. But Dan Reeves was not looking at the odds. He was looking at something else. They hesitated, he said. In 11 campaigns, did they ever hesitate? Did any pre-conclusion world ever make them hesitate? No one knew the answer. But the question itself felt important. Maya Chin, standing at her monitoring station, was watching a different set of data. Not the tactical display but the signal analysis, the Vorkai communications traffic. Dr. Whitfield, she said quietly. The communication patterns, they've changed. Whitfield was beside her in seconds. He looked at the data. They're transmitting a great deal more than before, he said. Internal communications, fleet-to-fleet traffic is up by a factor of 6. He paused. They're talking to each other. A lot. About what? Reeves asked from across the room. Whitfield looked at him. I can't translate it in real time. But the volume and the pattern? He paused. It looks like debate. Silence. They're arguing, Maya said softly. They're arguing, Whitfield confirmed. About what to do next. About whether the pre-conclusion world was quite as concluded as they had thought. Dan Reeves almost smiled. Good, he said. Let them argue. The Vorkai debate lasted 11 hours. Whitfield's team worked the entire time, trying to extract meaning from the communications traffic. They couldn't get full translation. The Vorkai language encoding was complex and the sample size was still insufficient. But they got fragments. Emotional tone markers. Structural patterns that suggested the nature of the disagreement. What they pieced together with significant uncertainty was this. High Commander Drex was arguing for continued advance. Modified approach, adjust tactics, but press forward. The pre-conclusion world had demonstrated unexpected capability but was still, fundamentally, a pre-conclusion world. Retreat would be unprecedented. Retreat would be weakness. At least some of his subordinates, how many was unclear, were arguing for something else. Not retreat exactly but caution. Reassessment. Perhaps even communication. There's a faction in that fleet, Whitfield told the command team, that thinks the situation is different from the 11 previous campaigns. They are not wrong. Can we exploit that? President Alden asked from Washington. She was attending the briefing via secure video link, and she looked as sharp and focused as she had on day 1, which Dan Reeves found quietly extraordinary. We can try, Whitfield said. If we send another signal, something calculated to deepen the uncertainty, to make the cautious faction's argument for them. What would we say? Reeves asked. Whitfield pulled up his notes. We say we have more. We are more. This is not our limit. Silence. Is that true? General Cole asked. Dan Reeves was quiet for a moment. It's true enough, he said. They sent the signal. The Vorkai debate after receiving the signal intensified. And then on hour 11 it ended. The fleet resumed its advance. But it did so differently. Instead of the tight, disciplined formation of before, the Vorkai spread their ships across a wider front. Vastly wider, over a zone that the remaining asteroid belt defenses couldn't cover completely. They were sacrificing formation cohesion for coverage, trying to avoid the choke point that Reeves had designed. They adapted, Captain Kim said. There was respect in her voice, despite everything. Yes, Reeves said. He had anticipated this. He had actually hoped for it. Because a spread formation, while harder to trap, was also harder to coordinate. Harder to support. Individual vessels, operating with more autonomy, would make different decisions under fire. Layer 2, he said. All units. The iron wall network shifted, drones and laser platforms reorienting to cover the wider front. It was not as effective as the original choke point, the geometry was wrong, but it was something. Harassment fire. Attrition. The accumulation of small damage across many vessels. The Vorkai came through the asteroid belt in a long grinding engagement that lasted nearly 8 hours. They destroyed most of what was there. But the price they paid was real. By the time the last elements of the Vorkai fleet cleared the inner edge of the asteroid belt and set their course for the inner solar system, for the red planet and beyond, for the blue dot that waited for them, their fleet was no longer 412 ships. It was 381. 31 vessels destroyed or disabled. Dozens more carrying damage. It was not enough. Everyone at the forge knew it was not enough. But it was 31 ships that would not reach Earth. 31 ships that had been stopped, not by a technologically superior force, not by a military machine built over centuries, but by humans who had had 20 days and the will to use them. The weight of what was coming hit people in different ways. Maya Chin found herself thinking about her mother in Portland. She had spoken to her twice since the president's broadcast, short, careful conversations in which she said as little as possible about where she was or what she was doing, and her mother, a gentle, perceptive woman who had raised Maya mostly alone and knew her daughter better than anyone, did not ask the questions that would have required lying. In the last call, her mother had said, "Maya, whatever it is you're doing over there, I know it matters. I know it's you doing it, so I know it's the best it can be." Maya had sat with that for a long time. Dan Reeves thought about his dogs. He thought about the house in Montana that needed painting. He thought about the poker game on Tuesday nights with his neighbors, ordinary people who had no idea he existed in any professional sense, who knew him only as the quiet guy down the road with the big dogs who was decent with cards. He thought, if this works they'll never know. If it doesn't work it won't matter. He thought, either way I'd rather be here than anywhere else. Dr. James Whitfield thought about his wife who had died 3 years ago, and who had spent 40 years listening to him talk about the possibility of contact and had always believed him, even when no one else did, even when he himself began to doubt. He had a photograph of her in his shirt pocket. He had carried it for 3 years. He touched it sometimes without thinking, the way you touch a talisman. He thought about what she would have said if she'd lived to see this. He thought she would have said, "James, you were always right. And then, now go make it count." Captain Zoe Vasquez thought about the man she had been dating for 7 months, a history teacher in Denver named Kyle Martin, who was at this moment, she assumed, doing what most of the world was doing. Watching the news, trying to understand, finding ways to go on with ordinary life in the shadow of extraordinary threat. She had not been able to tell him much. She had not been able to say what she was doing or where she was. She had sent him a text 3 days ago that said simply, "I love you. Take care of yourself. I'll explain everything when I can." He had texted back, "I know. I trust you. Come home." She held on to those 4 words like a life preserver in open water. The second major engagement happened at the orbit of Mars. Or rather, just before it. The Vorkai fleet, still in its wider spread formation, was decelerating now for the first time. Not stopping, but reducing speed in preparation for orbital approach. They were, Dan Reeves's analysts estimated, approximately 12 hours from Earth orbit when the engagement began. What the Vorkai did not know, what all their months of observation had not revealed, was that there was a weapon they had not accounted for. Not a weapon built in 20 days. Not part of Reeves's plan. But something that had existed, quiet and unacknowledged, for 15 years. Project Harbinger was the most classified program in the history of the United States military. Not even General Cole had known its full extent until the day after the president's broadcast. It had been developed by a small team within DARPA and the Classified Space Force Operations Division, the same division Dan Reeves had commanded, in response to exactly the kind of threat that no one officially believed was coming. It was a weapons platform. But not like the others. It was called, in the dry language of its program documentation, the Deep Space Autonomous Combat System. Its crew called it the Hammer. The Hammer was a single large spacecraft, 600 meters long, roughly cylindrical, carrying no human crew, that had been quietly assembled in deep space over the course of 8 years and had been waiting, cold and powered down, in a highly elliptical orbit that took it to the outer solar system and back in a 14-year cycle. It had been in the outer solar system when the Vorkai arrived. It was in the inner solar system now. The person who told Dan Reeves about the Hammer was a woman named Dr. Vanessa Cole, no relation to General Cole, 62 years old, the Classified Space Force's Senior Weapons Program Director, a small woman with gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead who had been at the forge from day one but had not, until now, volunteered that she had something relevant to contribute. "I should have told you earlier," she said in the tone of someone making an honest admission. I wasn't sure the asset was positioned to be useful. Now I think it is. Reeves stared at her for a long moment. You have a 600-meter autonomous weapons platform, he said, in the inner solar system. And you're telling me this now? I'm telling you this now because it's now in a position to intercept a significant portion of the Vorkai fleet between their current position and Mars orbit, she said, unruffled. Would you like to see the specifications, or would you prefer to continue being angry with me? He looked at her. Show me the specifications, he said. What the hammer carried was, by any human standard, extraordinary. Its primary weapon system was a series of mass driver cannons, electromagnetic accelerators that could launch dense metal slugs at a significant fraction of light speed. Not 0.27, more like 0.04. But at that speed, a 1 kilogram metal slug carried the kinetic energy of roughly 300 kilotons of TNT. It had 40 of them. It also carried a secondary battery of high-powered laser systems derived from the same research that had produced the lunar installation weapons, but scaled up by a factor of 10. It had been powered down to avoid detection, and the Vorkai, who had been observing the solar system for weeks with their advanced sensors, had apparently not found it. Why not? Reeves asked. Because it was never transmitting, Vanessa Cole said. No signal output, minimal thermal signature, positioned behind a large asteroid body until it began its approach maneuver 2 days ago. They may have it on sensors now, but at their current formation spread and approach angle, it's an ambiguous return. She paused. They probably think it's a rock. Dan Reeves looked at the tactical display for a long moment. The Vorkai fleet, spread across a wide front, was moving between the current position of Mars and the asteroid belt. The hammer, approaching from a slightly different angle, was... You saw it? Here, he said, touching the display. If it decelerates to match their approach speed and moves to this position, between the flanks of their formation, it can fire into the densest cluster of ships, Vanessa Cole finished. And they won't be expecting fire from inside their own formation. No, she agreed. They won't. He turned to look at her fully. Can you control it remotely from here? Command delay? Light speed lag at current positions is about 4 minutes each way. 8 minutes round trip. She paused. The weapon system is fully autonomous. I can give it targeting parameters and a fire solution, and it executes on its own timeline. And if it goes wrong? If the targeting AI makes a bad decision? Then I'm very sorry, she said simply. It was the most honest answer anyone had given him in 20 days. Do it, he said. The hammer's approach to its firing position took 3 hours. During those 3 hours, the Vorkai fleet continued its advance, apparently unaware or unconcerned by the object moving through space on an oblique angle to their formation. Whatever their sensors showed them, they did not react to it. At the forge, the tension on the command floor was unlike anything anyone there had experienced. People who had been running on adrenaline and caffeine for 3 weeks sat or stood at their stations with the particular focused stillness of people who have done everything they can do and are now waiting for the outcome. Maya Chin tracked the hammer's position on her display. She could see the Vorkai fleet on the same display, 381 ships spread across a zone hundreds of thousands of kilometers wide, moving with that terrible disciplined grace toward the world she had spent her whole life on. She thought, we found them. Now what do we do? And then she thought, Caro. And then what? And then, the hammer fired. 40 mass driver slugs, launched in a 6-second burst, moving at 4% of the speed of light, into the densest cluster of Vorkai vessels in the fleet center formation. The tactical display at the forge updated in real time. The first slug hit a Vorkai vessel. What analysis suggested was a troop transport, one of the larger ships in the fleet, dead center. The energy release was, by any measure, catastrophic. The vessel ceased to exist as a coherent structure in approximately 0.1 seconds. The second slug missed its primary target but struck a smaller escort vessel that had been positioned directly behind the larger ship. The escort was destroyed. The third, fourth, and fifth slugs hit in rapid sequence, 2 more vessels destroyed, 1 heavily damaged. 6 through 20 continued the pattern. Some missed. Most hit. In 6 seconds, the hammer destroyed or critically damaged 16 Vorkai vessels. Then the laser batteries opened up, sustained fire into the disorganized center of the Vorkai formation, and for 30 seconds the space between Mars orbit and the asteroid belt was the most violent place in the solar system. The Vorkai, to their credit, responded with impressive speed. Their surviving center formation vessels began evasive maneuvers, their weapon systems began tracking the hammer, and within 90 seconds, They had identified the source of the attack and concentrated their fire on it. The hammer was 600 meters of metal and weapons systems with no crew to protect. It absorbed 3 direct hits from Vorkai plasma weapons. The 4th hit destroyed it. But by then, it had fired all 40 of its primary projectiles and had run its laser batteries for 3 minutes. The final tally, 23 Vorkai vessels destroyed. 14 more heavily damaged. Total Vorkai fleet strength as of the engagement's end. 344 ships. At the forge, the room was very quiet for a long moment after the display updated. Then someone started applauding. It was Derek Park, the young DARPA scientist, and he wasn't applauding with the triumphant enthusiasm of victory. He was applauding the way you applaud something that is technically beautiful, with awe and something close to disbelief. Others joined. Not everyone. Some people were crying, quietly, for reasons that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the weight of what they were living through. Dan Reeves stood at the front of the room and looked at the display. 344 ships. Still more than the entirety of humanity's remaining space-based defense capability. Still coming. He turned to the room. Layer 3, he said. Everything we have. High Earth orbit. Now. The next 4 hours were, in Dan Reeves's estimation, the most extraordinary 4 hours of his life. Not because of what happened in space, though what happened in space was extraordinary enough. But because of what happened on Earth. The president's broadcast had been steady and honest throughout the crisis. Daily updates, factual and measured, neither minimizing the threat nor dramatizing it beyond what the facts warranted. The world had had 20 days to absorb the reality of what was coming, and it had done so in the chaotic, messy, deeply human way that the world absorbed everything. With fear and confusion and rage and grief and argument and, underneath all of that, something else. Something that manifested differently in different places but was, at its core, the same thing. In Seoul, 100,000 people gathered in a city square and sang. In Lagos, engineers who had been working on the Iron Wall Network's African elements for 20 days went home for the first time and found their neighborhoods filled with people who wanted to feed them, who brought them food and touched their hands and said, in different languages, the same thing. Thank you for what you're doing. In Chicago, a woman named Grace Rivera who had emigrated from Mexico 15 years ago and worked the night shift at a grocery store had been listening to the news on her phone between customers, and when the broadcast mentioned the hammer's engagement and the casualties it had inflicted on the Vorkai fleet, she set down the can of beans she was shelving and said, to no one in particular, yeah, that's right. And then kept working. In Tokyo, schoolchildren who had been sent home when the crisis began used the time to write letters, to their parents, to scientists, to soldiers, to the president, to the astronauts on the space stations that were now part of the defense grid. Thousands of letters. Tens of thousands. The government's communications office, overwhelmed, posted them online instead of delivering them individually, and they became the most read document on the internet for 3 days. One of the letters, written by a 10-year-old girl named Hannah, read, Dear person in space, I don't know your name. My mom says you are up there trying to keep us safe. Thank you. I'm sending you my drawing of our cat. His name is Butter. He is very brave. I think you are brave like Butter. Please come home. Someone printed it and posted it on the wall of the forge's main command room. Dan Reeves saw it and looked at it for a long time, and then turned away before anyone could see his face. The defense of Earth orbit was a joint operation on a scale that had no precedent. Admiral Torres commanded the overall naval formation, if naval was the right word for it. It included spacecraft from the United States, China, Russia, the European Space Agency, India, Japan, and 6 other nations. Most of these were not purpose-built warships. Many of them had been commercial or research spacecraft 20 days ago. But they had been armed with everything humanity had left, and they were crewed by people who understood exactly what they were defending. The orbital grid stretched from low Earth orbit to approximately 20,000 kilometers altitude. It was dense in some areas and thin in others, because the geometry of deploying in orbital mechanics is not like deploying on a flat battlefield. The Vorkai fleet, approaching from a specific direction, would encounter specific elements of the grid in a specific sequence. The first line, the outermost ring, consisted mostly of the smaller, more maneuverable platforms. Their job was not to win but to engage, to force the Vorkai to slow down, to fire, to spend energy and weapons charge in time. The second line was the heavier platforms, the ones carrying the most substantial weapons packages, the ones with the strongest armor, which was, by any honest assessment, not very strong but was better than nothing. The third line was everything else. The converted commercial platforms, the emergency-launched modules, the assets that weren't really weapon systems at all but were positioned to contribute what they could. And behind all of them, on the surface and in the atmosphere, was everything that couldn't be put in space. Ground-based missiles, laser arrays, railgun systems, weapons designed for a different kind of war but adapted, improvised, integrated into a unified defense architecture in ways that their designers had never intended. If something gets through the orbital grid, Torres had said in the briefing. Nothing gets through the orbital grid, Reeves had said. Torres had looked at him. Nothing gets through and impacts the surface, Reeves had clarified. Even if a vessel gets through the orbital platforms, the atmospheric and surface systems continue engaging it. We maintain fire all the way down. And if that's not enough? Then we improvise, Reeves had said, which was not a satisfying military answer but was the only honest one. High Commander Vorkai Drex was, for the first time in his career, uncertain. This was a profoundly uncomfortable sensation. He sat in his command chair aboard the Eternal Resolve and looked at the tactical display and processed the numbers. He had begun this campaign with 412 ships. He had 37 less than that now. More were damaged. The fleet that was approaching the pre-conclusion world's orbital space was not the fleet that had left the staging area. And there was something else. The pre-conclusion world, he had looked up what they called themselves based on the signals, humans or humanity, had done something that no pre-conclusion world had ever done. Not just defended. Not just fought back. They had surprised him. Multiple times. They had anticipated his adaptations and responded to them. They had used terrain and technology and what could only be described as tactical creativity in ways that did not fit the profile of a species this young and this isolated. He thought about the signal again. We are here. We are aware. We are ready. He had dismissed it as defiance. He was beginning to wonder if it had been something else. Not defiance. Not arrogance. Something harder and more specific. A statement of fact. He looked at the blue dot ahead. It was visible now on his display, small, blue-white, rotating, its single large moon a pale companion beside it. The arguments in his fleet had not ended with his decision to press forward. If anything, they had intensified after the Hammer engagement. Several of his ship commanders, experienced officers, people he respected, had come to him privately to express concerns. Not cowardice. Caution. They are not what the surveys said they were, one of them had told him. They are exactly what the surveys said they were, Drex had replied. Violent. Resourceful. Unpredictable. But still a pre-conclusion world. The surveys did not predict this level of resistance. The surveys were taken before they knew we were coming. The other commander had been quiet for a moment. Then, what does a species do, Commander, when it finds out it is not alone? When it finds out it is not at the top of the hierarchy it assumed it inhabited? Drex had not answered. Because the answer he was beginning to understand was this. They do this. They fight as if the outcome is not already written because for them, it is not. He was beginning to understand something else too. He had conquered 11 worlds. He had never conquered a world that knew it was being conquered before the battle was over. The Vorkai fleet reached Earth orbit after a transit through the inner solar system that lasted 4 hours and cost them 9 more vessels. Attrition from the remaining asteroid belt drones, from the lunar installation systems firing at extreme range, from debris and the accumulated damage of the asteroid belt engagement catching up with already stressed systems. 335 ships. They came in on the vector that Reeves had anticipated, the slightly tilted approach from the ecliptic plane, consistent with their formation geometry. They encountered the first line of the orbital grid at a range of approximately 22,000 kilometers. What happened next was the largest battle in the history of the solar system. It lasted 6 hours. The first-line platforms engaged the leading Vorkai vessels with everything they had, laser fire, kinetic impactors, the remaining EMP emitters, and a new weapon that Derek Park had designed in the last 48 hours based on the data from the asteroid belt engagement. A focused microwave emitter that, in theory, would interfere with the Vorkai ship's internal electronics at close range. In theory. In practice, it worked on roughly 40% of the targets it was used on, which was 40% more than it had worked on during the 24 hours of testing they had managed. The Vorkai fired back with brutal efficiency. The first-line platforms began taking losses immediately. These were not the small drones of the asteroid belt, these were crewed spacecraft, and when they went down, people died. Commander David Osei, 38 years old, Ghanaian Space Force, commanding the converted research platform Wisdom, took a direct plasma hit to his vessel's main power system 7 minutes into the engagement. He had 43 seconds to get his crew of 11 into the emergency escape pods before the Wisdom's reactor failed catastrophically. All 11 crew members made it to the pods. Commander Osei was the last one in. He was sealing the pod hatch when the secondary explosion hit. The pod launched with the hatch not quite fully sealed. It held, barely, and because the pod's automated systems compensated, but it held. David Osei, sitting in an emergency escape pod falling toward Earth's atmosphere with 10 other people and a not quite sealed hatch, looked out the small viewport at the battle raging in the space above him and thought, with a clarity that surprise and near death had burned into his mind like a brand, "We're going to win this. I don't know how, but we are." He was not an instinctively optimistic man. His crew would later say that Commander Osei's calm certainty in that moment, which he communicated to them because they needed it, was the thing that held them together in the hours they spent waiting for rescue. First-line losses by the end of Hour 2. 14 platforms destroyed. 7 more disabled. Approximately 80 crew dead or unaccounted for. Over 200 more in emergency pods or evacuated to backup positions. Vorkai losses in the same period. 21 vessels destroyed or disabled by the combined first-line weapons. Dozens more showing damage. It was not an even exchange. The humans were taking harder hits, proportionally. But they were not breaking. The second-line platforms moved up as the first line thinned, maintaining the pressure. Admiral Torres, in his command ship, a converted military communications platform that had never been designed for anything approaching combat but was doing its job with the quiet persistence of well-engineered hardware, ran the engagement with a focus and a steadiness that his staff found almost supernatural. "Torres doesn't look scared," Captain Kim said to Zoe Vasquez, watching the admiral from across the command section. "He's terrified," Vasquez said. Kim looked at her. "They're all terrified," Vasquez said. "The ones doing their jobs the best are the ones who are terrified and doing it anyway." At the forge, Dan Reeves watched the engagement unfold on the holographic display and did what he had been doing for 3 weeks. Processing information faster than any one person should be able to, finding patterns, anticipating, adapting. "They're concentrating on the southern hemisphere sector," he said. "They've identified the gap in our second-line coverage between 40 and 60 degrees south and they're pushing through it. We can't reinforce that sector without pulling from the northern defensive arc," Torres said over the link. "Don't pull from the north. What do we have in reserve that can reposition to the south without opening a gap? The Chinese contingent, 4 platforms. ESA Cluster 7, 3 platforms. Move them," Reeves said. "Route them through low Earth orbit to maintain atmospheric coverage. If anything slips through above them, the surface batteries can still engage. If anything slips through to surface battery range." "I know," Reeves said. "Move them." Hour 3. The engagement settled into something that had the terrible rhythm of a battle that is not going to end quickly. Both sides had adapted to the other's weapons and tactics. The Vorkai had learned to avoid the EMP emitters. The human platforms had learned that head-on engagement with a Vorkai vessel was suicide and that oblique, fast-moving attack profiles, hit and maneuver, never stay in one place, were the only viable tactic. Maya Chin, still at her monitoring station, was doing something that no one had explicitly asked her to do. She was watching the Vorkai. Not their weapons, not their formation, not their tactical movements, but their behavior. The patterns of their decision-making. The response times. The way individual vessels moved. She had been thinking about what Whitfield had said about the faction within the fleet that wanted caution. About the communications traffic spike after the first asteroid belt engagement. She was watching for hesitation. And she was beginning to see it. Not in the overall fleet. Drex's discipline held, and the fleet continued to advance and engage. But in specific vessels. In specific moments. Reaction times that were slightly longer than expected. Maneuvers that were more conservative than the tactical situation called for. Individual ships that, when the choice presented itself between pressing an advantage and maintaining position, consistently chose position. She made a list of these ships. She brought it to Whitfield. "These vessels," she said, pointing to her data. "I think these are the cautious faction. I think they're following orders but not with full commitment." Whitfield studied the data for a long moment. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting," Maya said carefully, "that we talk to them again. But not to the fleet. To these ships specifically. We can't address individual vessels in their fleet, we don't have that precision." "No," she agreed. "But we can transmit on the frequency and in the encoding that their internal fleet communications use." She paused. "We can make it look to their communication systems like a message from inside their own fleet." Whitfield stared at her. "That would be," he paused. "We'd need to encode it correctly, or it would be immediately identified as external. The encoding is complex." "I know," Maya said. But we've had their communications for 3 weeks. I've been working on the encoding structure. She put another printout on the table. I think I can do it. Whitfield looked at her. Then at the printout. Then back at her. What would we say? He asked. Maya had thought about this for 2 hours. This is not what we were told. They are not what the surveys said. The cost will be more than the gain. Caro. A long silence. The last word, Whitfield started. I know it's a human word, Maya said. I know they won't understand it literally. But it has a mathematical structure in our encoding that, in the context of the message, might read as a question. A challenge. She paused. And then what? What do you do after this? What comes next for you if you win at this cost? Whitfield was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, do it. They transmitted at hour 4 of the engagement. Maya Chin sat at the signals console with Dr. Whitfield beside her and sent a message into the middle of an active battle, encoded in the Vorkai's own communication format, on their own internal fleet frequency. It said as accurately as they could render it, this is not what we were told. They are not what the surveys said. The cost will be more than the gain. Caro. And then they waited. For 17 minutes, nothing changed. The battle continued. Vessels fired and burned and died. The Vorkai pressed their advance in the southern hemisphere sector. The human grid bent under the pressure but did not break. Then something happened. 3 of the vessels on Maya's list, 3 of the ships she had identified as showing hesitation behavior, altered their positions. Not drastically. Not obviously. But they moved to the edge of the formation. Away from the densest fighting. Into positions that were, militarily speaking, not optimal for the advance. They heard it, Maya said softly. They may have heard it, Whitfield said carefully. We don't know. They heard it, Maya said. She was watching the data with a certainty that was beyond logic, that came from 3 weeks of watching these ships, knowing their patterns, reading their behavior the way she might read a person's face. They heard it and it landed. Even if they heard it, there's nothing. Wait, Maya said. At 4:47 a.m., hour 5, a signal came from the Vorkai fleet. Not a weapons discharge. A transmission. On the frequency that humanity used for its own communications. In encoding that was, not quite human, not quite Vorkai, but something in between. Halting. Imprecise. Like someone using a language they had studied from recordings but never spoken aloud. It said, High Commander will hear you. High Commander asks, what is Caro? At the forge, the room went completely silent. Dan Reeves stared at the display. James Whitfield looked at Maya Chin. Maya Chin said very quietly, they're asking. She reached for the transmission console. What do I say? She asked. It was directed at the room, at no one specific, at everyone. It was Reeves who answered. Tell them the truth, he said. Maya transmitted. Caro means and then what? It is the question that never stops. You win. And then what? You take this world. And then what? You spend 400 ships and how many lives for a planet you did not need? And then what? We ask this question always. It is why we are still here. It is why we will always be here. She sent it. And then she sat back and looked at her screen and thought, that was either the most important thing I've ever said or the most foolish. The response took 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, the battle continued. 11 more vessels on both sides were destroyed or disabled. 3 more human crew members died. The southern sector gap was successfully reinforced. Then the signal came. High Commander says, you are the first pre-conclusion world to ask us this. All others asked only how to survive. You ask what comes after. Pause. Then. High Commander says, we do not have an answer. Another pause. High Commander says, we are listening. What happened in the next 3 hours is simultaneously the most documented and the most contested event in human history. The battle slowed. Not stopped. It did not stop immediately, and both sides continued to engage because in the chaos of a space battle with hundreds of vessels, orders take time to propagate and soldiers in the middle of an engagement are not instantly aware of diplomatic developments happening at command level. But it slowed. James Whitfield and Maya Chin, with minimal sleep and enormous concentration, maintained a halting, imprecise, extraordinary dialogue with the eternal resolve, mediated by the broken encoding that they had learned from 3 weeks of signals analysis. They talked about Caro. They talked about what it meant to fight for something rather than to fight against something. They talked about what Earth was, what humanity was, not as a strategic asset or a resource base but as a civilization. A messy, violent, brilliant, frightened, stubborn civilization that had had its entire worldview turned upside down 3 weeks ago and had responded by doing something unprecedented. They talked about the 11 worlds. I did not ask what was left of them, Drex said, through the halting translation, his voice coming through as something Whitfield later described as the sound of a very intelligent being having a very uncomfortable realization. Would you like to know? Whitfield asked. A long pause. No, Drex said. I believe I know. Another pause. Your surveys were wrong about us, Whitfield said. You saw what we were. You didn't see what we could become. Under pressure. What you became under pressure was unexpected, Drex acknowledged. Under pressure, Whitfield said carefully, is when you find out what something is really made of. The ceasefire order came at 7:32 a.m. hour 8. It came from High Commander Vorkai Drex, transmitted to his fleet. Not all of it was obeyed immediately. Not all of it was obeyed at all. There were elements of the Vorkai fleet that continued to engage for nearly 40 minutes after the ceasefire order, and 2 more human platforms were lost in that time. But by 8:17 a.m. the guns in Earth orbit were silent. For the first time in 8 hours, the space above the Earth was not on fire. At the forge no one spoke for a long time. Then Dan Reeves sat down in his chair, heavily like a man whose legs have finally decided they're done, and put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lifted it again and looked at the display. 302 Vorkai vessels remaining. Damaged, some of them badly. Not destroyed. Not retreating, yet. But still. Not firing. He looked at Maya Chin across the room. She was looking back at him. Her eyes were red. She had not slept in 31 hours. She was 26 years old and she had just talked an alien fleet into a ceasefire. Good job, Miss Chin, he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I don't think that word covers it, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The ceasefire was not peace. Everyone at the forge understood that. The Vorkai fleet was still in Earth orbit. 302 warships, damaged but functional, positioned above a world they had come to take. The ceasefire was a pause, a moment of uncertainty in which a conversation was still happening and the outcome was still undetermined. They could restart at any moment, General Cole said in a tactical assessment that followed the ceasefire. If Drex decides we've stalled him long enough, if the faction that wants to press forward reasserts itself, if any element of his fleet acts independently. I know, Reeves said. Then what are we doing? Buying time, Reeves said. And talking. He paused. James, what's your read? Whitfield, across the table, looked exhausted to his bones. He had been translating and constructing messages for 3 hours on essentially no sleep. But his eyes were sharp. Drex is genuinely uncertain, he said. That's not a diplomatic read, that's a behavioral analysis. The communications pattern, the response times, the structure of his phrasing. This is a man who has encountered something he doesn't have a framework for. He paused. That can go 2 ways. It can make him more dangerous. Uncertainty can resolve into aggression when someone is used to having answers. Or it can make him open to a different outcome than the one he planned for. Which way is it going? President Alden asked. She had been on the secure video link throughout, as steady and focused as ever, though the strain around her eyes showed. I believe it's going the second way, Whitfield said. And I believe Maya Chen's message was the reason. Caro, Alden said quietly. Caro, Whitfield confirmed. And then what? It's a question Drex hadn't asked himself, apparently. About the campaign. About the Empire. About, he paused. He's 11 worlds in, Madam President. He's done this 11 times. And I think, sitting in his command chair above the 12th for the first time, he's asking what it's all for. The room was quiet. That's the conversation we need to have, Alden said. Not a tactical conversation. A real one. He may not be capable of that kind of conversation, Torres said. He was not being cynical, just precise. He's a military commander of an empire. His entire framework is conquest. Can he think outside that framework well enough to? Every framework has edges, Maya Chin said from her station. Everyone looked at her. She looked slightly surprised to have spoken. I mean, every way of thinking has limits. Has assumptions built into it. And when you hit the limit, when reality doesn't fit the model, either the model expands or it breaks. She paused. Drex hit the limit when the hammer fired. He hit it again when the second engagement happened. And then we asked him a question his model had never included. She was quiet for a moment. I think the model is expanding. President Alden looked at her for a long moment. How do we help it expand in the right direction? She asked. Maya thought about it. We tell him who we are, she said. Not what we can do. who we are. The second communication session between humanity and High Commander Vorkai Drex lasted 4 hours. It was conducted by Maya Chen and James Whitfield, with President Alden contributing directly at 2 points. Moments that Whitfield later said were pivotal, because Drex's response to the signal that she was addressing him personally demonstrated a change in how he was framing the interaction. What they told him, haltingly, imprecisely, in a pidgin of mathematics and borrowed encoding and raw data transmissions and occasional moments that nobody could quite explain in retrospect but that seemed to work, was this: humanity was young. 40,000 years of behavioral modernity, 4,000 years of recorded history, a few hundred years of science and technology. By any galactic standard, infants. But humanity had something that their surveys had documented without understanding: the capacity for change, the speed of adaptation, the willingness, under pressure, to become something new, something that had not existed before the pressure was applied. When your first scouts scanned this system, Whitfield transmitted, the creatures on this planet were fighting each other with guns made of metal and chemical explosive. 20 days ago, when your fleet was detected, those same creatures built a defense network that reached to the asteroid belt and deployed an autonomous weapons platform that had been quietly waiting in deep space for 15 years. Pause. Do you understand what that means? In 20 days, we did not become what you saw attack you in the asteroid belt. We already were that. We had been, quietly for 15 years, preparing for something we weren't even sure existed. Because that's what we do. We prepare. We learn. We adapt. You were looking at a species 1,000 years behind you in development. You were not looking at a species 1,000 years behind you in will. A long silence from the eternal resolve. Then your preparation was hidden. Why hidden? Because we are afraid, Whitfield transmitted. We are afraid of each other. We are afraid of what we might do with the things we build. We hide them from ourselves because we don't fully trust ourselves. Pause. But we don't hide them from threats. When the threat came, we showed you everything. Another silence. Then Drex sent something that took Whitfield and Maya 20 minutes to translate fully, because it was long and complex and structured in a way they hadn't seen in the Vorkai communications before. Something that suggested, structurally, that it was personal. Not tactical. Not diplomatic. Personal. What it said, as best they could render it: I have conquered 11 worlds. None of them asked what I would do after. None of them thought beyond their own survival to the shape of what came next. You are the first species we have encountered that fights for something larger than survival. I do not know a word in my language for this. I am using your word. Caro. I am asking Caro. I do not have an answer. I am uncertain what to do with this uncertainty. Maya read the translation twice. Then she said, he doesn't know how to not conquer us. No, Whitfield said. He doesn't. Then we have to show him there's another option. President Sarah Alden addressed Vorkai Drex directly for the first time at hour 2 of the session. She did not speak through the encoding system. She spoke in her own voice, recorded and transmitted as audio, with the mathematical encoding carrying a framework that Whitfield hoped would convey tone if not literal meaning. It was the most imprecise communication modality they had, and also, Alden had argued, the most honest. Commander Drex, she said. I'm speaking to you as the leader of the largest single nation on this world, authorized to speak for the unified defense of this planet. I want to say something that has no strategic purpose and no tactical advantage. I want to say it because I believe it's true, and I believe truth is the only thing worth building anything on. She paused. We don't want to destroy you. We don't want to drive you away and forget you existed. We don't want to do to you what you came here to do to us. Another pause. We want what we've always wanted, even when we couldn't manage it among ourselves, to know we're not alone. To know that the universe is larger than our fear of it. To build something with you rather than against you, even knowing you came here as an enemy. Even knowing what it cost both of us to get to this moment. Her voice was very steady. I know this may not be possible. I know your empire has a logic that doesn't include this kind of conversation. But I have to believe, that you didn't fire your weapons for the last 4 hours because some part of you is asking the same question we've always asked when we look at the stars. She stopped. We are here. We are aware. We are ready. Not for war. For this. Silence. Then, HFY, from this moment the signal cut. It resumed 40 seconds later. HFY, from this moment, I am listening. What happened after was not quick. It was not clean. It was not the triumphant moment that the stories written later tried to make it into. It was messy and exhausting and terrifying by turns, and 3 times in the next 48 hours, the ceasefire nearly broke down completely. The first time was when a Vorkai vessel, not one of Drex's, fired on a human rescue craft that was attempting to recover escape pod survivors from an earlier engagement. The vessel's commander later claimed the rescue craft had been perceived as an attack run. The rescue craft was disabled. All 4 crew members aboard survived, but one was critically injured. Dan Reeves spent 90 minutes talking Torres out of an immediate retaliatory strike, because the retaliatory strike would have killed the ceasefire and probably Maya Chen's entire diplomatic effort along with it. If we fire, we lose the conversation, Reeves said. If we don't fire, we show weakness, Torres said. We show restraint, Reeves said. Those are different things. Not in military culture. Then we need to change what our military culture looks like to them. Reeves paused. We're trying to show them that that what comes after, can be different from what they expect. We don't show that by shooting. Torres looked at him for a long moment. I hate this, he said. I know, Reeves said. Do it anyway. The second near breakdown was internal, a crisis within the human coalition when the Russian and Chinese contingents, responding to pressure from their home governments, raised concerns about the terms being discussed with Drex. Specifically, what were the terms? What was being offered? What was being promised? The conversations between Whitfield, Maya, and Alden on one side and Drex on the other were being conducted in real time and in a communication format that most of the coalition partners couldn't monitor directly. Director Hansen spent 6 hours managing this crisis, individually briefing every coalition partner's senior representative at the Forge, answering the same questions 17 times, building consensus around a framework that she described as the worst possible deal except for all the alternatives. The framework was simple. Nothing was promised. Nothing was given. What was offered was continued conversation and the commitment that, if a resolution could be found that did not involve destruction, humanity would pursue it with the same determination it had pursued the fight. Most of the coalition partners accepted this. 2 of them, for a terrifying 12 hours, did not. The third near breakdown was from Drex's side. A faction within his fleet, the aggressive contingent, the ones who had argued against the hesitation and the ceasefire from the beginning, attempted to bypass Drex's command authority and transmit a targeting solution to the fleet's weapon systems. What stopped them was not human action but Vorkai action. 3 of the ships that Maya had identified as the cautious faction moved to intercept positions relative to the aggressive faction's vessels. It was not combat, it was a positioning statement. And Drex, informed of the situation, acted decisively in a way that ended the mutiny attempt before it fully formed. He's maintaining control of his fleet, Whitfield said, watching the ship movements. Not easily. But he's maintaining it. That means he's committed to the conversation, Maya said. For now, Whitfield cautioned. For now is enough, Maya said. For now is all we've ever had. The conversation evolved. Over 48 hours of halting, imprecise, extraordinary dialogue, a shape began to emerge from it. Not an agreement, not yet, but the outlines of a possible understanding. What Drex needed, what his empire needed behind the campaign, was resources. Territory. The Keth corridor loss had been devastating. It had pushed the empire's frontier back in a way that threatened the resource supply chains that kept 6,000 years of civilization functional. The Vorkai didn't come to Earth for conquest as an end in itself. They came because they needed the solar system's resources. Because they needed a foothold. Because they were, in the language of the report that Dan Reeves had written 18 months ago and that no one had read, a civilization under existential pressure looking for relief. They're not that different from us, Maya said when this understanding crystallized. She was standing at her monitoring station staring at the data. They're afraid. They're running out of something. They don't know what to do about it. They came to take ours, Captain Kim said. Not hostile, just precise. Yes, Maya said. Because they didn't know there was another option. Because in 6,000 years of empire, they had never needed another option. She looked at the display. What if we showed them there was? What Maya was thinking about, what she spent 4 hours in a room with President Alden and Dan Reeves and Director Hansen working out, was this. The solar system was, by most measures, resource-rich beyond anything a civilization of 8 billion people needed for the foreseeable future. The asteroid belt alone contained enough metals to build a version of human civilization for thousands of years. Jupiter's atmosphere. The Kuiper belt. The Oort cloud at the very edge of the sun's influence. Humanity had barely touched any of it. The Vorkai needed resources. Humanity had resources. And humanity needed something that the Vorkai had, though nobody had explicitly said this yet. the knowledge of a 6,000-year-old spacefaring civilization, the star maps, the technology, the understanding of a universe that humans had been guessing at from the bottom of a gravity well for their entire history. It was not a simple calculation. It was not a safe one. It required trusting a species that had shown up with 400 warships and demonstrated its intentions clearly. It required offering something real and valuable to an entity that had just spent 8 hours trying to destroy human platforms in orbit. It required, in other words, doing the thing that humanity found hardest and most necessary in equal measure. Trusting in the possibility of something better, even when the evidence for it was limited and the risk was enormous. "This is insane," General Cole said flatly when the framework was presented to him. "Yes," President Alden said. "We're talking about inviting a hostile alien empire to participate in the economic development of our solar system. We're talking about offering an alternative to war," Alden said. "Yes, it's insane. It's also the thing that has any chance of working long-term." She looked at him. "Right. If we fight, if the ceasefire breaks and we go back to shooting, what happens?" Cole was quiet. "Our orbital grid is depleted," he said. "We used most of our reserves in the first engagement. We can make them hurt. We can make it very expensive. But we probably can't win," Alden said. "Not with what we have left," Cole admitted. "So the choice is, offer something insane that might work, or fight a battle we probably can't win." She looked around the room. "I know which one I'm choosing." Dan Reeves, in the corner of the room, had been listening silently. He said, "One condition." Everyone looked at him. "They leave orbit," he said. "Before any resource discussion, before any framework, before any next step, they leave Earth orbit. They move their fleet back to the asteroid belt. We need that as the opening position. If they can't agree to that, if they won't give up the position of physical dominance, then they're not actually choosing the conversation. They're stalling." Alden thought about it. "That's a hard ask," Whitfield said. "It's a huge concession on their side. Tactically, yes," Reeves said. "Which is exactly why it matters. If Drex orders his fleet out of Earth orbit, he's telling his aggressive faction that the conversation is real. He's putting his credibility on the line." He paused. "And if he won't do it, if he can't afford to do it, then we know the conversation isn't real." The room was quiet. "Ask him," Alden said. Maya Chin transmitted the request at 11:47 p.m. on day 23. "HFY, from this moment what comes next cannot begin while your fleet stands above our world," she sent. "We ask that your fleet withdraw to the asteroid belt. Not as surrender. As the first step of something that has never been done between our kinds." She sat back and waited. The response came 40 minutes later. HFY. Just those 3 words encoded in the Vorkai format. "From this moment." It was, as best Whitfield could determine, an affirmative. And 20 minutes after that, the holographic display at the forge showed the Vorkai fleet beginning to move. Slowly. With the deliberate, disciplined movement of an entity that was doing something it had never done before and was determined to do it correctly. Moving away from Earth. Moving back toward the asteroid belt. 302 ships retreating. At the forge, the silence lasted for almost a full minute. Then Dan Reeves stood up and he looked at the display and he said very quietly, "Caro." And the room, exhausted, frightened, relieved, full of people who had not slept properly in 3 weeks and who had survived something that should not have been survivable, let out a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a sob and was, in the end, the most human sound that any of them had ever heard. 3 months later. The world had changed. Not in the dramatic, instantaneous way that disaster movies imagined. Everything different overnight, a clear before and after. It had changed in the gradual, complicated, deeply human way that things actually change. In fits and starts, with setbacks and breakthroughs and arguments and quiet moments of recognition that yes, actually, everything is different now and we have to figure out what that means. The Vorkai fleet remained in the asteroid belt as agreed. The retreat from Earth orbit had held. High Commander Drex had returned to Vorkai space, aboard the Eternal Resolve with a significant portion of the fleet, and the report he had delivered to the Vorkai Imperial Council was, by all accounts that the human intelligence teams could piece together, extraordinary. He had told them that the campaign was suspended. He had told them that a different path was available. He had told them apparently about Caro. The Imperial Council had not been pleased. But the Imperial Council was not unanimous, and the faction within the Vorkai government that had always questioned the campaign, that had, Whitfield's team came to understand, been asking questions similar to Drex's for a very long time, was now speaking with an authority it had not previously had. The 47 Vorkai vessels that remained in the asteroid belt, a smaller group left behind under a separate commander who had been part of the cautious faction, were, in an arrangement that had no formal name yet and no established protocol, conducting what could loosely be described as preliminary resource discussions with a joint human team. Those discussions were going slowly. They were going badly at moments. There were cultural misunderstandings that created crises, and communication failures that created dangers, and at least 3 incidents in the first month that had required every diplomatic skill the human team possessed to defuse. But they were continuing. And continuing, Maya Chen had come to believe, was the most important thing. Maya Chen had been home to Portland for 1 week. Just 1 week before she had to come back. The work was not done, might never be fully done in her lifetime, and the monitoring division had become something rather more permanent than a graduate school assignment. But she had gone home. She had sat in her mother's kitchen and eaten her mother's food and told her mother, now finally clear to know, everything that had happened. Her mother had listened for 3 hours, mostly in silence, with the same steady attentiveness she had always given her daughter's most important thoughts. When Maya finished, her mother said, "You talked to them?" "Yes." "About Caro?" "Yes." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Do you know where that word comes from, Maya? In our family?" Maya looked at her. "What?" "Your grandmother used to say it," her mother said. "Whenever something was hard. Whenever something seemed impossible. She would say Caro, meaning, well, you know what it means. And then what? And then we keep going." Maya was very still. She didn't know what it meant in any other language, her mother said. She had a word for it. Because she needed a word for it. She looked at her daughter. "I think everyone needs that word. Maybe it's just that, maybe everyone already has it somewhere. And sometimes it takes a crisis to find it." Maya thought about Drex. About the 47 ships in the asteroid belt. About the halting, imprecise, ongoing conversation between 2 civilizations that had begun in weapons and was, slowly, messily, with no guarantee of success, trying to become something else. She thought, maybe. And then what? And then we find out. Dan Reeves went back to Montana. He stayed for 3 weeks, long enough to paint the house, which needed it. Long enough to have his Tuesday poker game, and to sit on the porch with his dogs in the evenings and look at the sky, which was the same sky it had always been and entirely different. General Cole called him at the end of the first week. "We need you back," Cole said. "The new Joint Command structure." "I'll be there," Reeves said. 3 more weeks. "The timeline is 3 weeks, Ray," Reeves said. "I've been awake for what feels like most of a year. Give me 3 weeks." Cole gave him 3 weeks. On the last evening before he drove to the airport, Dan Reeves sat on his porch and watched the sun go down over the mountains and thought about what came next. The new Joint Command structure, a permanent, multinational space defense organization that had been proposed by President Alden and was being negotiated with 37 nations, was going to be the most complex institutional undertaking in human history. The resource framework with the Vorkai, if it ever became a real agreement, was going to require technology and logistics that humanity hadn't developed yet. The cultural translation work, the ongoing effort to actually understand the Vorkai, their language, their history, their needs, was going to take decades. And there was the rest of the galaxy. There were other civilizations out there. Some of them knew about Earth now. Some of them had known for much longer than the Vorkai had. What were their intentions? What were their capabilities? The universe, which had been very quiet and very distant for 4 billion years, was no longer either of those things. Dan Reeves looked at the stars, at the specific patch of sky where he knew, from memory, the direction of the Vorkai asteroid belt contingent, and thought, we're not ready for this. And then we never are. And then so we get ready. We always get ready. He scratched his German shepherd behind the ears. The dog leaned against him, solid and warm, completely indifferent to the galactic situation. Come on, Reeves said. Let's go inside. Dr. James Whitfield received, 3 months after the ceasefire, an honorary doctorate from the University of Auckland, where the first public SETI observation of the Vorkai signal had been confirmed. He accepted it in a brief ceremony that was, like most public ceremonies in this new world, slightly surreal, cameras everywhere, people treating the occasion with the weight it deserved but also struggling to find the right tone for a moment that didn't have precedent. He held the degree and thought about his wife. He had been right. She had known he was right. He stood at the podium and said the thing he had wanted to say in public for 40 years. The universe is not empty. It never was. We were just not looking carefully enough for long enough at the right things. He paused. We know better now. What we do with that knowledge is, as it has always been, entirely up to us. He paused again. Caro, he said. The audience, scientists, diplomats, survivors, and a handful of Vorkai observers attending via a communication link that would have seemed impossible a year ago, was quiet for a moment. Then they responded. Not with the uniform, organized acknowledgement of a planned ceremony. With the scattered, individual, deeply felt repetition of a word that had meant nothing in human language 2 months ago and now meant more than any single language could contain. Caro, Caro, Caro. The cost had been real. This was the thing that the stories, written quickly in the weeks after the ceasefire, tended to underemphasize. The stories focused on the miracle, on the ceasefire, on the conversation, on the extraordinary turn that had converted an existential battle into the beginning of an unlikely diplomacy. The cost was real and it deserved to be remembered. 87 people had died in the orbital engagement. Not an abstract number, 87 specific, irreplaceable human beings, each with a life that had been entire unto itself, each leaving behind people who would feel the absence for the rest of their lives. They came from 19 countries. The youngest was 22 years old, a Ukrainian systems technician named Ivan Marchenko, who had volunteered for his platform's crew because, as he had told his supervisor, someone has to and I'm good at this. He was killed when the platform he was on took a direct Vorkai plasma hit in hour 2 of the orbital engagement. His supervisor spent 3 months trying to write a letter to his mother in a town outside Kiev that adequately explained why he had been there and what he had done. She never felt the letter was adequate. The letters never are. Commander David Osei survived. His crew of 11 survived. He returned to Ghana 3 weeks after the ceasefire, having spent most of the intervening time giving testimony to the joint investigation of the engagement, and was met at Accra's airport by a crowd of several thousand people. He did not give a speech, he had been asked to and had declined. He just stood there for a moment, blinking in the equatorial sunlight, shaking hands, embracing colleagues, and then, when he was finally in a car and moving, he pressed his face against the window like a child and watched the city go by and did not speak until he got home. His daughter, 8 years old, met him at the door. "Dad," she said. "Did you win?" He picked her up and held her and said, "I came home. That's the win that matters." The memorial was held at Cape Canaveral 6 weeks after the ceasefire. All 37 contributing nations sent representatives. Several heads of state attended. The Vorkai observation vessel, one of the 47, sent as a gesture toward the emerging relationship, transmitted, through the relay system that Whitfield's team had established, what Whitfield later interpreted as an acknowledgement of the fallen. Not quite condolences. The Vorkai cultural framework around death was different enough that a direct analogy was imprecise. But there was something in the transmission, something about permanence and consequence, about the weight of what had been paid, that was close enough. President Alden spoke. She named every one of the 87. She said, "They did not die for a country. They did not die for a flag. They died for the oldest, simplest, most fundamental reason that any human being has ever given their life, so that the people they loved could live." She paused. That is not a political statement. It is not a military one. It is not even really a human one. It is the statement of a species that understands what it means to be alive, and what it means to lose that and refuses to treat that loss as small. She looked out at the crowd. They are not here to ask what comes next. We ask it for them. Caro. And then what? We carry them forward in the answer. Maya Chin was asked to speak at the memorial. She almost declined. She had not been military. She had not been in the battle. She had found a signal and made a phone call and stayed up for an improbable number of hours doing signals analysis. It did not feel like the kind of thing that earned a place at a ceremony for people who had actually died. Dan Reeves, when she expressed this to him, said, "Without you, the battle is all there is. There's no ceasefire. No conversation. Just a fight we probably lose, and the ones who died for nothing except maybe making the cost high enough that the Vorkai decided Earth wasn't worth it." He paused. "You made their deaths mean something. You made the whole thing mean something. Go speak." She spoke. She said, "I'm a scientist. I spend my life looking at signals, at the information that the universe is constantly broadcasting, that tells us things about distance and time and energy and the structure of reality. Most of it we don't understand. Most of it we're only beginning to learn to read." She paused. 3 months ago, I found a signal I didn't expect. I called my advisor because I was trained to escalate when something exceeds my ability to understand it alone. She paused again. That's what this is. All of it. Something that exceeds our ability to understand it alone. The signal didn't come from outer space, it came from inside us. From the decision to stand and fight. From the decision to stop fighting when there was another option. From the decision to ask, in the middle of the most dangerous moment in our history, what comes after. She looked out at the crowd. I don't know what comes after. I know that the people whose names were read today paid for the chance to find out. I know that I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that chance counts. She stepped back. The crowd was quiet. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone said it. Carol. And the crowd took it up, one voice at a time, spreading through the assembly like a wave on still water. Carol. 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 Captain Zoe Vasquez flew back to Denver 2 days after the memorial. Kyle Martin was at the airport. He had driven 2 hours to pick her up because that was the kind of person he was, and when she came through the arrivals gate he looked at her, tired, thinner than she'd been, with something in her eyes that hadn't been there when she left, a new depth that he recognized as experience and weight and the specific mark that extraordinary things leave on ordinary people, and he just held her for a long time. Eventually he said into her hair, "You explained everything in a press release." She laughed, a real laugh, the first real laugh she'd had in a month. I know. I'm sorry. The press release was pretty good. The press release was classified. So how did I read it? Somebody leaked it. She pulled back to look at him. Probably Derek Park. He does things like that. Kyle looked at her. Are you okay? She thought about it honestly. I will be, she said. There's a lot of work still to do. A lot of we're not done. It's not over. It's just different. She paused. But yes, I will be. He nodded. He understood, she thought, more than she expected. Maybe because he was a history teacher and history teachers understand better than most people that the end of one thing is always also the beginning of something else. Come on, he said. I made dinner. They drove home through the Colorado evening, and the mountains were pink with the last light, and above them, in the sky that was the same sky and entirely different, the stars were coming out one by one. 1 year later. The Meridian was the first human spacecraft built specifically for deep space travel and contact operations. It was 230 meters long. It carried a crew of 47, scientists, diplomats, engineers, military personnel, and one signals analyst named Maya Chin who had negotiated her own position on the manifest over the objections of 3 different people who felt that the person who had arguably saved the world should probably not be putting herself in new kinds of danger. She had pointed out that the person who had arguably saved the world had done so by running toward the difficult thing, not away from it. They had stopped objecting. Commander Daniel Reeves commanded the Meridian. He had accepted the commission with the condition that he was allowed to bring his German Shepherd, whose name was Apollo, and who therefore became the first dog in deep space, a fact that generated more public interest than almost any other aspect of the mission, which Dan Reeves found simultaneously baffling and deeply appropriate. Humans, he said to Apollo, who was looking out the viewport at the Earth diminishing below them and appeared to be taking the situation philosophically. The mission was not, yet, interstellar. The Meridian was not capable of 0.27 light speed. It was not, honestly, capable of very fast travel by any galactic standard. What it was capable of was a transit to the asteroid belt, where the 47 Vorkai vessels still waited, and where a more permanent version of the resource and knowledge exchange framework had been slowly, painstakingly, excruciatingly assembled over the past year. It was the first time that humans had traveled to meet the Vorkai on something other than purely human ground. It felt significant. It was significant. In the Meridian signal suite, Maya Chin sat at a console that was in many ways the descendant of the equipment she had been using in the Atacama Desert a year ago, and watched the star field on her display, and thought about how different everything was. She had her doctoral thesis sitting in a folder on her laptop. Unfinished, abandoned 11 months ago when the world changed. She was going to finish it eventually. She had been told, by her advisor, who had also turned out to be a fairly significant figure in subsequent events, that her committee was prepared to waive most of the traditional requirements given the circumstances. She had thanked them and said she wanted to finish it properly. Because that was the thing she had come to understand about doing things right. You didn't get to use extraordinary circumstances as an excuse not to finish what you started. Extraordinary circumstances were just circumstances with the volume turned up. The work was still the work. She pulled up the thesis draft. She added a new introduction. This thesis began as an investigation of anomalous radio wave patterns in the outer solar system. It has become something somewhat larger than that. The anomalous signal that prompted this investigation was the leading edge of an alien fleet with hostile intent. The investigation of that signal led, eventually, to a ceasefire, a diplomatic framework, and the beginning of the most consequential interspecies dialogue in human history. None of this was what I expected when I sat down at that console in Chile at 3 in the morning. The signal I found was extraordinary. The signal I sent later was the one that mattered. She looked at what she had written. She added one more line. Caro. The Meridian reached the asteroid belt rendezvous point 17 days after departure. The Vorkai vessels were exactly where they were supposed to be, 47 ships in a loose formation around a large asteroid that had been designated, in the working framework documents, as Exchange Point 1. The name was procedural and boring, which Maya thought was exactly right. The beginning of the most important thing in human history should probably not have a dramatic name. It should have a name that suggested work to be done and conversations to be had and problems to be solved. Exchange Point 1. The Meridian moved into its designated position, and Maya watched the Vorkai vessels on her display, calm, patient, waiting. These were the cautious faction's ships. These were the ones who had heard the question in the message and had made a different choice. She thought about what Drex had said. I do not have an answer. I am uncertain what to do with this uncertainty. She thought, that's all right. We don't have the answer either. That's the whole point. The Meridian's communication system activated. Maya reached for the transmit key. She paused. She thought about her mother in Portland. About Whitfield, who was on Earth, who was too old for deep space travel but had sent her 17 pages of notes on communication protocols and one brief message that said, "You don't need my notes. You never did. Trust yourself." She thought about the 87 names at Cape Canaveral. She thought about David Osei's daughter asking if he had one. She thought about Dan Reeves in the command section of this ship, looking at the stars with the same intensity he had always looked at them, with the same refusal to accept that the outcome was already written. She thought about Apollo the German shepherd, who was probably asleep somewhere on the ship and was completely indifferent to the galactic situation. She smiled. And then she pressed transmit. Exchange Point 1, this is Meridian. We are in position. We are ready to begin. She paused. HFY. From this moment. The Vorkai response came 47 seconds later, quick because the distance was small and because they had been waiting and because Maya thought they were ready too. HFY. From this moment. We are listening. Dan Reeves stood at the viewport of the Meridian's command section and looked at the asteroid belt spread around them. The tumbling rocks, the distant glitter of the Vorkai vessels, the sun reduced to a bright point much smaller than it looked from Earth, and felt something that he had been searching for a word for since the night on the roof of the Johnston Atoll Command Center. It was not pride. It was bigger than pride. It was not hope. It was more specific than hope. It was something like the feeling of standing at the beginning of something that has no end in sight and knowing that the not ending, the going on, the refusal of conclusion, is not a failure of resolution but the actual point. He thought of Maya's word. He thought of what she had said it meant. And then what? What came next was negotiation and struggle and failure and breakthrough and the slow, painful, magnificent work of two species trying to understand each other across a gap that was as deep as 6,000 years of different history and as narrow as the single moment when one party had asked a question and the other party had not had an answer. What came next was the rest of it. He looked out the viewport at the stars. Caro, he thought. And then what? And then this. And then more. And then we find out. He turned from the viewport. All right, he said to no one in particular and everyone. Let's get to work. Apollo the German shepherd woke up from his nap, stretched extensively, and trotted to the viewport to see what all the fuss was about. He looked at the asteroid belt for a moment. Then he looked at Dan Reeves. Then he put his head under Reeves's hand, requesting attention, because regardless of what was happening in the geopolitical and interstellar situation, he had not been adequately petted in the last several hours and this was a problem that needed addressing. Dan Reeves scratched him behind the ears. Good dog, he said. Apollo agreed. Somewhere in the asteroid belt, on Exchange Point 1, the first formal meeting between human and Vorkai representatives was beginning. Somewhere on Earth, James Whitfield was reading Maya's new thesis introduction and smiling. Somewhere in a kitchen in Portland, a woman was making tea and looking out her window at the sky and thinking about her daughter, out there among the stars, asking and then what? Somewhere in the depths of Vorkai space, a council was arguing about what had happened and what it meant and what came next. And somewhere in the command section of the Meridian, a man with a gray-templed head and tired, sharp eyes was doing what he had always done, looking at the stars and refusing to accept that the outcome was already written. Caro. And then what? And then we find out. Epilogue, what they said after. From Maya Chen's doctoral thesis, submitted 2 years after the ceasefire, titled anomalous signal patterns in the outer heliosphere and the communication framework of the first contact event. The signal I detected on that October night was, in retrospect, simple. High frequency, structured, moving. What made it significant was not its complexity but its intentionality, the unmistakable signature of something designed. What made my response to it significant was not my expertise but my instinct, that when you find something real, you call the person who needs to know. Everything that followed, the defense, the battle, the ceasefire, the conversation, the word that became something larger than any one language could contain, grew from that instinct. Not from genius. Not from preparation. From the basic human refusal to look at something extraordinary and pretend it is ordinary. We are not the largest civilization in this galaxy. We are not the oldest. We are not, by most measures, the most powerful. We are, by most measures, very young and very loud and very prone to making the same mistakes over and over again. But we ask questions that don't stop. We ask what comes next and what comes after that and what comes after that. We ask it when we're afraid. We ask it when we're failing. We ask it in the dark, in the middle of the night, at 3 a.m. at a monitoring station in Chile, looking at a screen that shows something that changes everything. Caro. And then what? The answer, as best as I can determine after 2 years of working on it, is more. More questions. More work. More failure and breakthrough and conversation and struggle. More of the thing that makes us what we are. I think that's enough. I think that's everything. From the personal journal of High Commander Vorkydrex, translated by the Whitfieldchian linguistic team, entry dated approximately 3 months after the ceasefire. I return to this record today for the first time since the campaign. I have been asked by the Council to provide a full account of my reasoning, why I ordered the ceasefire, why I began the conversation, why I chose a path that has no precedent in our history. I find that the reasoning is difficult to articulate in our language. The structures of our language assume certain things about the relationship between a stronger party and a weaker one, and those assumptions do not apply to what happened at the third planet. I have been using a word from the human's language. My staff find this amusing. I find it necessary. There is no equivalent in ours. Caro. And then what? I asked myself this question, sitting in my command chair above their world, with their weapons striking my ships and their words striking something harder to name. I asked, if we take this world, and then what? If we add it to our territories, and then what? If we destroy what they have built and use what they have, and the generation after us does the same again to the next world, and then what? I did not have an answer. I am not certain the question has an answer. I am beginning to think that is the point of asking it. They are strange, these humans. Small and brief, as I said to them. But the question they ask is not small and it is not brief. It is the question of everything. HFY. From this moment I am trying to learn to ask it properly. I suspect it will take some time. From a speech by President Sarah Alden, delivered at the first anniversary of the ceasefire, to an audience of 37 nations and 1 Vorkai diplomatic observation vessel. A year ago we stood at the edge of something we had never faced. We faced it the way humans face everything we have ever faced. Imperfectly, together, with fear and courage tangled so tightly we couldn't always tell them apart. We are not finished. We will never be finished. There is no version of this story where the work is done and the questions are answered and the universe is safe and known. That is not what the universe is. That is not what we are. What we are is the thing that keeps asking. The thing that stands at the edge and looks out and says, and then what? And goes to find out. That is not a small thing to be. It is, I believe, everything. The end.